Thank you. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. Just came down by Eurostar. Amazingly easy to get from London here and back. But I'm excited to be here because I've heard quite a bit about what you are doing with Vision 2020, what you're doing with sourcing and sustainability. And I think there's a great opportunity to talk about how that connects to the idea of creating shared value, and where sustainability and shared value overlap and where they're different. Just to give you a little background, Michael Porter and I started FSG, a nonprofit consulting firm, about 15 years ago. And when we started, we called it Foundation Strategy Group, because the idea was to work with charitable foundations on how to be more effective in their giving, thinking that that would really be a powerful way to help solve social problems. And what we discovered after about a year, we were hired by Shell Oil Company. And the more we looked at their philanthropy, which was substantial, the more we realized that what they did in their business had far more impact on society than anything they could do through their philanthropy. And that led us to begin to shift our thinking, to rethink about what is the role that business should play in society. And how does this connect to the competitive advantage and the success of a company? And so that led us through a series of 3 articles that Porter and I wrote in Harvard Business Review. The first one was called The Competitive Advantage of Corporate Philanthropy, because we were still thinking about philanthropy. But what we realized is that when companies stopped thinking about philanthropy as being nice and as being about public relations, and started to think about social issues that mattered to the business, first, they got much more benefit. And second, they could be much more effective because they understood the issue. The example we talked about in that article was Cisco Systems, the networking company. And about 10 years ago, Cisco discovered that one of the big constraints on their growth was that there weren't enough trained network administrators in the world for their customers to hire to manage the equipment that Cisco wanted to sell to them. Now, there are a lot of failures in educational systems around the world. This isn't unusual. But Cisco said, we could solve this problem. Nobody in the world knows how to train network administrators better than we do. We'd have to have a physical place where people could work on the equipment, but we could create a distance learning curriculum, a 2-year-long course, to ensure that anybody who graduated anywhere in the world got to the same level of quality. And so they began to set up these networking academies around the world, and they used their sales offices all over the world to find local partners. So they found universities in China, they found secondary schools in inner city communities that were very poor in the US, they found community-based organizations in developing countries, remote areas in India or in the Middle East. And they now have they're in 165 countries. There are 10,000 networking academies around the world. They've graduated 4 million network administrators. Now, it's philanthropy. They're not making direct money from this. But they've fundamentally changed a constraint on their business. And because these 4 million people are being trained on Cisco equipment, it's actually contributed to their competitive advantage over other networking companies, as well as expanding the market and potential for everyone. So that was the idea of the competitive advantage of corporate philanthropy. But the more we thought about it, the more we realized this goes way beyond philanthropy, and that there really is an opportunity to rethink the role of business in society here. And that is what led us really to this idea of creating shared value. The idea that for a company to succeed, the conditions in the regions where it operates, the social and environmental conditions, matter. They contribute to the competitive advantage. And for an economy to grow, to civilization to be successful, it needs a strong economic base. It needs competitive businesses. And we realized so much of the writing about business in society has been about holding business back, has been about trying to limit business, has been on the assumption that government and nonprofits, charities, fix social problems, business causes them. And so a lot of the thinking, and I would argue that a lot of the thinking around sustainability is about restraining business from creating harm, environmental damage, bad labor conditions, so on. But what we thought was being missed was the real synergy, the opportunity for business to solve social problems and make money in doing it. And I think that the key shift around creating shared value is that it really is about solving social problems that are related to the business. And I think it goes much beyond sustainability. So we said, business can engage with society in three ways. There's still philanthropy, there's corporate social responsibility, and there's creating shared value. Philanthropy is about giving back to the community, and that's good, that's expected of companies, and they need to continue doing that. Corporate social responsibility is really about mitigating harm, and companies need to do that. And shared value does not replace philanthropy, and it does not replace corporate social responsibility. But in addition, we said, business can find new opportunities for competitive advantage by beginning to think about social issues as part of their corporate strategy, beginning to think about what's good for their customers, beginning to think about what's good for their suppliers, beginning to think about what they can do to change social and environmental conditions in ways that contribute to their own success. And that's the idea of shared value. It overlaps with sustainability. And we find companies, yesterday I was with folks from Novo Nordisk in Denmark, and they are absolutely following a shared value strategy. They call it triple bottom line. Other companies, Verizon is following a shared value strategy. They call it shared success. Each company has its own words, and there are certainly companies that under the banner of sustainability are really creating shared value. But the concepts, I think, are not identical. One of the problems in explaining the difference between shared value and sustainability is that people mean many different things by sustainability. So in my mind, there are sort of two versions of sustainability. One is purely about the environment. It's about preserving scarce resources, reducing the footprint, and so on. And when a company finds a way to innovate, as Danone is, that reduces its use of water, reduces its use of energy, and thereby saves money, is more profitable, that's shared value, and that's also certainly sustainability. There's a broader definition of sustainability which really has to do with rethinking capitalism. A different model for how the world could operate to ensure that people and planet are protected as the population continues to grow. Shared value is not that visionary. Shared value really works with capitalism and the market as it is today. It's about things companies can do today in the current structure and the current incentives that change the world for the better. And so the overlap with this larger issue of sustainability, I think, is much less. And when a company does something like Cisco training network administrators, I'm not sure that would fall under sustainability, even the larger version. I mean, in a sense, they're sustaining the future of their industry by training people. But I don't think it would be classically considered sustainability. So I want to give you some more examples, but let me talk a little bit just about the framework for a minute to be clear about it. When we talk about creating shared value, we talk about it happening at three levels. The first is new products and new markets. The second is redefining productivity in the value chain. And the third is about strengthening the industry and regional clusters where a company operates. So the first one, and Danone has examples of all of these, I believe. The first one is new products and new markets. So if you've found a way to sell to low-income populations in emerging markets, smaller portions, informal distribution systems, that's reaching a new market. When you found a way to differentiate your product by increasing its nutritional value or reducing sugar and fat, that's creating shared value, and that's in the product market. When you've reduced your energy use, when you've reduced your water use, that's redefining productivity in the value chain, and you're certainly doing that. And when you strengthen the communities where you're operating, when you think about how palm oil plantations can be more productive and avoid deforestation, I think that that is part of the cluster idea. But as I understand where Danone is today, it strikes me that it is very rooted in a classical definition of sustainability. It's really looking at the company's impact on a particular set of issues and trying, again, to reduce harms, to reduce the footprint, looking inwardly, looking mostly at what's happening within the company, and doing things that, by and large, others in the industry are already doing. So that's good, and that's important. It's not necessarily going to give you a competitive advantage if everybody else in the industry is doing the same thing. And what we've seen are really interesting examples where companies have gone beyond that because they've really started to build social and environmental factors into their core competitive strategy and to differentiate themselves that way. So what's an example? I think a really interesting example is Yara, which is a Norwegian fertilizer company, largest fertilizer company in the world. And they realize there's immense opportunity to sell more fertilizer in Africa, where very little fertilizer is used by farmers, mostly smallholders. But to do that, you need to really find ways both for farmers to have access to inputs and to increase their income so they can afford to buy fertilizers and things. Now, there are lots of efforts that the World Bank and USAID and other development agencies have done to improve farmer productivity. But one of the things that happens is if you work with smallhold farmers and increase their yields, you can actually destroy the price if there's no distribution mechanism beyond the region, because all of a sudden the region is flooded with coffee or cocoa or whatever it might be, and the price drops and the farmers are actually worse off than before. So Yara said, you know, we really need to think about the entire value chain of agriculture. And we need to think about, in a country like Tanzania, how we can create an agricultural corridor that runs through the entire country, connecting smallhold farmers to ports so they have access to international trade and global companies. And so they began to work with the World Economic Forum and development agencies and the government of Tanzania to develop this concept of an agricultural corridor that would actually cover a third of the country. Now, there's a whole sequence of things that had to happen to do it, right? You needed transportation, but before you could have transportation, you needed access to fuel and energy. You needed, distribution of agricultural inputs. You needed cold chain storage to prevent spoilage. You needed to tie it into the needs of global corporations that would be buying these commodities. At the end of the day, they developed a project that brought together 250 different organizations around a common agenda to create this agricultural corridor. 38 different companies were involved. Companies like Bayer and Syngenta and Unilever and so on. Development agencies were involved. The government of Tanzania was involved. Power companies were involved. Shipping companies were involved. Now, Yara couldn't control the whole thing. These people didn't work for Yara. But Yara could create the common agenda and help orchestrate the efforts of these different companies and NGOs and governments. And the result is an agricultural corridor in Tanzania that will have a profound impact on the productivity of smallhold farmers and incomes in that country, and will also, has already more than doubled the sales of fertilizers for Yara in that region. It's a problem-solving approach that goes beyond thinking about what we're doing in our company alone. It says there are issues and problems out there in the world that we can lead change. We don't control them. And again, it's different than working with your employees, different than working with your suppliers, because you don't control the other people. But you can set the agenda and you can orchestrate the process in a way that gives your company a competitive advantage and has a profound effect. Another example, we've been working at FSG with Eli Lilly and Company. Lilly has a set of products that involve nutritional supplements. They're mostly dairy-based. They wanted to enter the market in India. They couldn't find a reliable supply of dairy products, of milk, from local farmers at a scale that would enable them to create the operations they wanted to create. They too have begun an operation that involves NGOs, that involves government, that involves other companies in raising the productivity of dairy farmers in India, in the regions where they operate, to give themselves a better supply. Walmart doing the same thing in Africa. They've started to open stores in Africa. They want to sell produce. They can't find an adequate supply of produce from smallhold farmers, working with them to increase productivity and yields. So what we're finding is companies going beyond conventional sustainability to identify and tackle problems. We're also finding lots of unusual partners in doing that. So Coca-Cola has been working with the Gates Foundation to help farmers transition from the crops they were growing in South Africa to fruit, because Coke wants to sell fruit juices there, too expensive to import pulp. They'll buy the fruit from the farmers, but there's a transition process where the farmers have to plant new trees and learn how to manage them and have some period of time before there's a harvest that they can sell. Now, on the one hand, you say it's crazy. The world's largest foundation is giving money to one of the world's largest profit-making companies. But on the other hand, you say, well, actually, it makes perfect sense, because Gates wants to improve incomes for farmers. But they don't want the farmers to be dependent on their philanthropy indefinitely. Coke wants to buy from the farmers fruit, but it's not worth it for them to invest if they have to pay all of the transition costs. And so there's a perfect synergy. So we're finding interesting bedfellows. Well, I don't want to give you the sense that it's just about smallholder farmers. Of course it's not. But we're seeing examples of innovation that come from sustainability. So Nike, the athletic apparel company and shoe company, has been trying to reduce their environmental footprint significantly. And it's changed the direction of their research and development. And actually, it's fascinating to look at their sustainability department, because they've actually hired venture capitalists in their sustainability department, because they want to find and invest in new businesses that are creating products and services that are useful to them. And so they found a company, for example, that has a way of dyeing fabric that doesn't use water. So they've invested in that company. Powerful for them. But they also challenged their R&D staff to develop a shoe that had no waste products. And the staff came up with the idea of a knitted shoe, so that there's a single strand of synthetic fiber which is knitted to create the shoe. It led to a new generation of shoes that were lighter and higher performance than anything they'd made before, was used in the last Olympics, and again, was a source of innovation for them. Not just thinking about how do we reduce our emissions, but how do we do things differently in a way that enables us to get a competitive advantage. And that's really core to the idea of creating shared value. We've been writing up some teaching cases for Harvard Business School, and there's some very interesting companies there. One of my favorite examples is a health insurance company from South Africa called Discovery Health. They started about 10 years ago with the idea that they could use behavioral economics to improve the health of their members. So they have a whole set of financial incentives. If you have their health insurance, they'll pay your health club membership, but only if you go twice a week. You have a card you have to swipe. If you don't go, they stop paying. When you go to the grocery store, you swipe the card, and you'll automatically be reimbursed 25% of whatever you spend on fresh fruit and vegetables, but only fresh fruit and vegetables. Okay? They have a whole set of these incentives, and they have had studies done. Johns Hopkins University did a study that their members actually have a longer life expectancy. They actually get sick less often. When they're sick, they recover more quickly. And so their health costs are lower. Here's a health insurance company that has said, our job isn't just to cover costs. Our job is to make people healthier and reduce medical costs. They've become the dominant health insurance company in South Africa. They're operating now in China. They're in the UK. They're in a number of other countries, Australia. And they're taking this model forward. They're also applying it in different ways. And so they've started selling auto insurance. And if you give them permission, they will put a little device in your car that actually tracks your driving behavior, your braking, your accelerating, and so on. And you'll get feedback in the way of points for better driving. And if you get enough points, they'll pay half your gasoline bill. Now, everybody, it turns out, thinks they're an above average driver, which of course is impossible. And none of us really know because we have no feedback. They can actually watch over the first 6 months that someone has this device in their car, people's driving improve as they're getting this feedback. And their insured drivers have half the number of fatalities from car accidents of the population as a whole. Again, they've rethought the nature of their business to build a competitive advantage out of a social benefit that they are providing, and created a more profitable model for themselves in doing that. We often talk about Nestle and the Maggi cubes, the bouillon cubes that they sell in India and West Africa that are designed to have iron and vitamin A and other nutrients that are in short supply to address malnutrition. I understand they sell something like 90 million a day and have had a significant impact on micronutrient deficiencies in regions of West Africa. But to do that, they had to understand the problem at a way that we don't usually think about social issues. The nonprofit sector is full of good ideas that if people were rational, they would follow. But people aren't, and they don't. So to develop this product, Nestle actually sent anthropologists out into homes of low-income families in the regions where they wanted to sell it. They went to 1,500 families to look at how typically the women cooked, how they used their limited budget, and to design a product that could cover up the bitter taste of the iron and some of the other micronutrients, but would be cheap enough to be affordable and would have the right flavors and spices that women would want to use it in their cooking. They had to really understand the issue and the population just as they would any other new product design. But core to this product was creating greater sense of nutrients. I think what we've seen is that when a company begins to think about shared value, it opens up some new doors, new products, new ways of thinking about the cluster, new ways of thinking about their value chain. But it's also quite a long journey because companies are not set up to think this way. We've seen companies create new positions, vice president for shared value, vice president for social innovation, because typically the people who think about the social issues are in the CSR or sustainability department and are not the same people who are designing new products, are not the same people who are leading operations. And so there's often a shift that has to happen. One of the other cases we're writing up is Novartis, the pharmaceutical company. And they started a program a few years ago in India. They were selling, and had been for many years, their pharmaceuticals in the major cities where there were hospitals and doctors and pharmacies and so on. But 70% of the population lives in rural villages where they had no access. And in fact, where they still practice traditional medicine, which can sometimes be good and sometimes be lethal. For example, the traditional Ayurvedic approach to treating diarrhea is that it comes from an excess of fluids. So you don't give people fluids. Well, of course, what kills children with diarrhea is dehydration. It's exactly the wrong answer. So they said, we've got to get people to begin to think about basic health-seeking behavior, sanitation, hand washing, recognizing symptoms of disease, the idea of going to a doctor, nurse, someone to be diagnosed, getting treated. So they hired 300 healthcare workers from the villages, women from the villages, and trained them to be healthcare educators. These weren't salespeople. Their job was just to go around from village to village with kind of a cartoon kit, because many of these people were illiterate, to tell stories about how to improve health, about how to engage in basic healthcare behavior. And then they had a distribution network that involved 50,000 local pharmacies and clinics to get their drugs out there. It's been a very successful program. It took them about 3 years before it broke even, much longer than usual. But it's now profitable. It's reaching a population of 80 million people that they couldn't sell to before. They've started to bring it out in Kenya and in Vietnam. And they have a new business model that frankly can reach many more people than their traditional business model ever has reached. What's fascinating as we're writing up the case is the internal tensions within the company we're finding. It's a highly commission-driven company. And in order to get the drugs out to these rural areas, they still have to go through the urban distributors, which are divided up into different districts and on which people's commissions are based. And this model, while it's profitable, has a higher cost structure. And it turns out these wonderfully innovative, passionate people who have developed this model, who've brought healthcare to these tens of millions of people, are spending more of their time putting out internal fires and battles because there's huge arguments over who gets credit for the sales that went through an urban district, which division has to bear the added costs of this. The entire structure of the organization and its compensation scheme has fought against this new market innovation. And so what we're seeing is that while shared value can sound simple, just a new way of thinking about things, the reality is within companies it often requires quite profound change in what is being measured and reported, in how people are compensated, in the organizational structure, in who has to work with whom to share that information. We're finding companies actually begin to take a social purpose as part of their competitive positioning. Nike says we're about health and wellness. We're not just an apparel and footwear company. IBM says we're about a smarter planet. We work with cities and governments around the world to use big data to solve problems like crime or traffic or water usage. And in that purpose, we find they are attracting customers who like to be part of that purpose, recruiting employees who want to work for a company that has a social purpose, and finding new opportunities to do things differently than they have before and incubate new projects that can create a competitive advantage for them. So I spend my time nowadays wandering around the world, giving talks about shared value. We've now spoken and had conferences on pretty much every continent, perhaps not Antarctica. But it has been amazing to me the resonance that this idea has had. The companies in every region of the world who see this as a new opportunity. The governments, Korea, India, Colombia, that are beginning to think about how do we create government policies that promote shared value on the part of companies. The development agencies, the World Bank, IFC, who have said how do we work with companies differently to help fund projects that create shared value. And I do believe that bringing companies to the table, not just to think about minimizing their footprint, which is important, but to think about how they can use their core skills, products, services to help solve social problems in the world, is a fundamental change, and one I believe that will enable us to make much more progress on social issues in the coming decade than we have in many decades before. And indeed one that will enable companies to find new sources of competitive advantage that really matter. If Michael Porter were standing here, he would say he thinks this is the next big thing in management strategy. He thinks this is not a small idea, but that learning how to create shared value is going to be the challenge for companies in the coming decade.